Hello, this is Minder Chen. I'm a professor of Management Information Systems at Martin V. Smith School of Business and Economics, California State University, Channel Island. Today, we're going to talk about design thinking, and this is part of the entrepreneurship video series. Here, I list some online resources for you to study further, so go and try to get it. And Tim Brown, who is the president and CEO of IDEO, defined design thinking in the following. Design thinking is a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for business success. So basically, in the definition, Tim Brown pointed out three key elements, which is human-centered, that's the people, the technology, as well as the business aspect of a design thinking endeavor. And you're encouraged to actually check out this HBR, Harvard Business Review article on design thinking. Tom Kelley, who is also a member of the IDEO firm's founding member, and described design thinking the following way. He said that it's not just problem solving, it's actually tried to take a creative leap. And the problem we try to solve through design thinking tends to be pretty messy, chaotic, and sometimes we call it wicked problems. So a lot of times there's really no single right answers. And you do want to take multiple points of views when you study the problem domain. And it required visions and multiple perspectives in addressing the pressing issues. You want to have an open attitude to come up with and welcome different suggestions and solutions. You do want to take action and conduct experiments. You learn from those experience and with deep reflections, what you learn from those action and experiments. And you're encouraged to actually develop prototypes, pilots, to particularly if you design product, then you play with various material. They call it think with your hands. And the process tends to following the steps laid out here, which you start with divergent thinking. You come up with lots of ideas, and then you try to consolidate or simulate those ideas in first, and then you try to narrow it down through convergent thinking. So this is what the statement here is referring to, which is start with broadening and followed by narrowing. So you actually start with broadening from one issue. You start to take a very broad viewpoints to look at it, but eventually you need to solve the problem, implement a solution. You need to narrow it down. That's what narrowing means. So we'll discuss this when we discuss the kind of design thinking process, which is really part of the creative problem solving process to some extent. And design thinking requires ongoing mindfulness, which means that we put your mind into it and have the empathy to think in other people's shoes. And design can be described at different level. Some people just don't even thinking about design at all individually or as an organization. Some think about design as a style, which is it's an avenue to being hip and cool. Something just looks pretty good, attractive. But a step beyond that, you not only pay attention to the form, but also pay attention to the functions. Because design makes things work better than they did before. So you definitely need to pay attention, not just the style, form, but also the function, which is, in terms of product and service, are the features provided by your product or service. And eventually, a longer term, we're talking about problem-solving skill. Design finds new opportunity by solving existing problem, and a much longer-term efforts in terms of design thinking is problem framing. Design redefine or reframe the challenges faced our organizations or even our country. So design thinking, if you move up this ladder, potentially will give you the competitive edge. We're moving in the last few decades from design to design thinking. Design tends to be, in the past, individual effort. We're talking about product, like industrial design tends to focus on product itself. And industrial design tends to focus on the engineering and the art aspect of the design of the product. Artistic aspect of the design for an engineered product. And design thinking requires teamwork because it requires multiple perspective and multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary teamwork. And design is not just about product anymore, it's about service and also the experience people have with your product or services. And design thinking emphasizes human, people, technology, and business together, and need to integrate these three components together in the context of design thinking. Design thinking has come of age, and increasingly corporation or professional service firms are working to create a design-centric cultures. The reason is many product or service or even processes, business processes, are now technologically complex, and people have hard time using it, and so they need help. And design thinking can help us to design product, service, or process to make it easier for people to experience your product and service in a better way. So the idea is that people need their interaction with technology and other complex systems, and that interaction need to be very intuitive, pleasurable, and simple. So empathy, experimentation, and other approach that we will use under design thinking can help us to create the kind of interactions to achieve the quality that needs to spread from product design function to the whole organization. Which means the design thinking is not just belongs to the product design group, but the whole organization need to think in certain way to embrace the design thinking philosophy. So what is the design-centric culture? We focus on users' experience, especially their emotional aspect of their experience. We'll try to create model prototype to examine a complex problem. And because the prototype can be used to explore potential solution, not just try to understand the problem, but to explore potential solutions. And since designing a new product or services, we may encounter failure multiple times, so a culture that tolerates failure is important. And design thinking is really an essential tool for simplifying and humanizing. And so the challenge when we try to promote the design-centric culture are the following. First, accepting more ambiguity due to the nature of uncertainty involved in creating new products and services. And second, embracing risk due to the high failure rate. So embrace risk, tolerate failure are the same thing. And third, resetting expectation. Setting the right expectation is the way to go. You should now go and find this video on YouTube. It's called IDEO Shopping Cart. And it's a special segment from Nightline. And they went to IDEO firm and asked them to design a shopping cart. And the program documented the whole process. So when you watch the video, I want you to pay attention to, first is the overall process that the design firm, IDEO, used in creating the shopping cart. And the process involved multiple steps, so pay attention to different steps. And each of the steps also pay attention to the technique that they use. And then we'll come back and continue this video because we're going to kind of analyze what we learned from this shopping cart case. How a professional design firm designed an everyday shopping cart used in the supermarket. And in IDEO, they believe, the executive team and their member believe that one doesn't manage creativity, but you do want to create an environment that nurture creativity. And however, although we don't manage creativity, but we need to manage for creativity. In this case, it seems to be contradictory, but it's really mean that we need to manage the creative problem-solving process or the design process. So process is very important. And design has to be done by teams, and we want to tap ideas from all members of the team, regardless of their ranks. And the team member tends to be from various disciplines. And there's a myth about lone inventor hiding somewhere in the garage to create a wonderful product. In reality, we want to encourage and enable collaboration among team members or even outside stakeholders. And in IDEO, they promote the so-called enlightened try and error by its creative team. And so the team would succeed over the planning of a lone genius. So try and error is important. And in the video, you found that they came up with some drawing just on a piece of paper of a shopping cart, which at the end, this is their creation. But it went through several iterations until they came up with the final prototype. They do have a pretty good workshop with all the tool and gadgets, so they managed to actually create a very realistic prototype such as this one showing here in only 5 days of work. So let's kind of look at the design process, which is what I want you to pay attention to when you watch the video. They start with gathering facts and existing knowledge using secondary resource search or field research. Field research, for instance, they went to just grocery store and asked shoppers, ask store employee, and this step, it's called empathize. They want to empathize with people who on daily basis may be using the product or service. The second step is they come back and share the facts, their observation, their insight with a team. And so they try to define what are the key issues they need to address. For instance, safety, easy to push around, and a few others. So they try to define kind of requirement from the user's, customer's perspective. And in order to solve that, they conduct some brainstorming section, multiple brainstorming section. This is called ideate. Ideate is just creating new ideas. And in the process, you try to build on others' ideas. And once you have clear ideas in terms of what need to be built, they actually use, they break the team up into subgroup to develop several prototypes. And eventually they merge various prototypes, nice feature together into the final prototype. And they do bring their prototype to the to the field to test it and go through a iterative process to refine the prototype until they come up with the final design. So the process that we just went through based on that shopping cart design experience can be kind of laid out in the following fashion. First, it's basically following a creative problem-solving process. And if we simplify it, it usually goes through a 3-step process. Idea generation, generate ideas. Idea organization, get the idea organized, like removing some duplication, combining certain idea to consolidate that because they're similar, and eventually evaluate the ideas to kind of narrow it down. So this is actually, if we draw this is kind of go broad and then get it organized and then go narrow. So it's kind of divergent thinking first over here, and then convergent thinking towards the end through idea evaluation using voting, various voting mechanism. So this is called ideation. In IDEO methodology, this is called ideation. And the idea generation is through brainstorming. Is one of the most common technique. There are some variation of brainstorming technique, but it's the most common one. So we'll stick with brainstorming. But be aware there are other idea generation technique. Brainstorming is just one of the most popular one out there. And when you conduct brainstorming, it's very important that you would come up with the right brainstorming question first. I sometimes call it triggering questions. And then you conduct the brainstorming, you come up with lots of ideas, and eventually want to cluster those ideas, which is really idea organizations. And once you've organize the idea in different categories, remove redundancy, consolidate similar idea into different categories. Then we can go to the move to the idea evaluation phase. Voting, in this case, used for people to choose the idea based on certain criteria. And eventually, based on the final and narrow down ideas, we can pursue to the next stage to develop the prototype. And once the prototype being developed, then we can go through the field test. And based on the feedback from the test, we can come back and revise the prototype and then retest it again. And sometimes we may actually go back all the way back to the ideation stage to generate more ideas and then prototype again. There are several brainstorming rules, very common. You need to be aware of it, so remember it. First, defer judgment. Don't judge anybody's idea, including yours. Encourage wild ideas. Be as creative, innovative as possible. Don't think about whether this is feasible, whether it will be too costly. And go for quantity. With large amount of ideas, some good one would surface among those. And build on the ideas of others. So intrigued by someone else's idea and then build on top of it. Piggyback on someone's idea is encouraged. Okay, so typically those are the 4 principles for brainstorming. In IDEO, they add a few more. One is one conversation at a time. If you're a facilitator of the brainstorming session, you want to make sure people focus on one conversation at a time. Also, their discussion is surrounded based on the triggering brainstorming question. So they will stay focused on the topic. Be visual. Use some visual aids. For instance, write down people's idea, numbering it so people can easily say, oh, that number 3 idea is that I have another idea similar to that. So it's easier for people to talk about idea that has been generated. And so you want to make those ideas, write it on some flip chart papers, on the whiteboard, use large post-it note to kind of write it up. And you can make sketches, mind map, and diagram to show the idea as well. So we mentioned some of the principles. This is kind of similar. I'm going to just pick and choose a few that may not be covered in the previous slide. We mentioned defer judgment. It is important that you don't even judge your own ideas. Just let your creative mind work and then talk whatever comes to your mind. And this will allow you to connect to the unconscious and also lower your fears. Go for volume is basically emphasizing quantity over quality. Be visual, have a lot of public display space, and use drawing if you wish. Headline means that if someone describes an idea in a very long format, you try to shorten it. Get the gist of what they're really trying to say. Use a few keywords to kind of summarize it, at least for the participant. And this is where the facilitator can be very helpful. Okay, you're not going to just write down whatever they're saying, words by words. Also build on the idea of others potentially can lower the barrier of the ownership, because eventually we really don't know which idea is coming from whom anymore, because it's kind of all mixed together. And also this kind of encourage you to steal other people's idea. The better way to say it is piggyback on someone else's ideas. And encourage wild idea is because we try to defeat so-called group things. People kind of in a group tends to think alike. They don't want to break away from other people's kind of mode of thinking and try to break away that stereotype. So once again, try to reiterate some of the brainstorming approach principle. Make many sketches, build a creative framework. We try to bring order out of chaos. Apply integrative thinking. Try to build implementation down the road. Put the customer in the midst of everything. So have the customer in mind. Create a scenario, user scenario, and describe customer's journey. Build prototype and test it, and rebuild the prototype, retest it again and again. Tell stories, keep the ideas alive, and be able to communicate your ideas to others to get feedback. Prototype more, some more. Test with user, test internally and certainly externally. And Linus Pauling, a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, I believe, said if you want a good idea, start with lots of ideas. There are techniques that people can use to create innovative ideas. A method called Scampers has been developed to help us during the brainstorming session to create innovative ideas. Scamper is just an acronym of substitute, combine, adapt. M stands for modify, magnify, or minify. I'll try to minimize it. P stands for put to other use, and E stands for eliminate, and R could be reverse or rearrange. So basically, you kind of break down a service or product into component and see what you can substitute, how you can combine different things, how you can adapt something to different purpose. Can you magnify or enlarge, for instance, like have a larger screen for your smartphone, and whether you can put some of your product or service to other use. And one way to find other uses is actually talk to the user to see how they're using your product. Sometimes they will use it for an intended purpose. Eliminate things that's not really contributing much to the functionality, usefulness of your systems. So let's look at a few examples. Eliminates. This is Picasso's drawing of a cow or bull, and he started with a very realistic kind of drawing and eventually captured only the essence of it. At Apple University, they actually use this to kind of train their employee in terms of simplicity in product design. This is a different generation of the mouse from Apple Inc. Reverse rearrange. Let's use restaurant as example. For instance, fast food restaurant like McDonald's, they have a very themed front stage operation. It tends to be just self-service. There's a waiting line. So the backstage, they have a lot of employees working in assembly line factions to produce the hamburger as fast as they can. That's their business model. So you don't expect a lot of service when you go to McDonald's or similar fast food restaurant. But a typical, particular high-end gourmet restaurant, it's really all about your dining room experience. So you will have servants who would kind of introduce you to the menu and suggest desserts and drink and things like that. And certainly there's still a backstage. However, there are different type of restaurant. One is teppanyaki styles restaurant, which basically the cook who used to be in the kitchen now come out up front in the at the dining table. The chef will cook in front of the dining table. The chef, frankly speaking, doesn't really need many years of training. However, the chef need to be have the personality that are willing and enjoy talking to other people, to the restaurant's customer, because you're right in front of the customer cooking. So engage the customers in some conversation is almost a must. Sometimes they do a little bit show and tells. If you think that's all the possible arrangement for a restaurant, you are totally wrong. In Asia, in China particularly, there's something called hot pot. And so the hot pot restaurant, hot pot is like fondue, but they don't use cheese. They use hot soup base, and then you have all the raw material ingredients, and then you kind of throw it into the boiled water in the pot and then cook it yourself. So this type of restaurant, you don't even have the chef. You do need to have people in the kitchen just preparing the ingredients, and you get rid of the chef, which is one of the kind of critical element for most of the restaurant. But in the hot pot restaurant, not anymore. So if you kind of dissect a product or service into smaller module, then we can think about whether we can reverse some of this component or rearrange, get rid of some, replace one with another, etc. Rearrange, let's look at the following diagram first. We can engage in the following exercise to some extent. You can list a list of product, a list of target market, a list of emerging technology, a list of function for potential product or services, and then you can kind of randomly pick and choose different things, and then to think about whether you can come up with some innovative product or services. And this is partially something called imagination, which is ability to kind of combine different concepts together. That ability is called conceptual combination, which really is so-called imagination. So we can kind of go over an exercise, ask people to list some social trends, some needs in the society or potential customer segment, a list of customer segment, a list of emerging technology. Then we can kind of choose various elements in each of this list, and then see if we can come up with something to address based on certain social trend. We identify certain needs in certain community, target segment, and then use certain emergent technology to solve a problem. Okay. For instance, some elderly may have may easily get lost because of illness. And then if we can have some tracking device, then we can track them down and then know where they came from. And that will be an important issue or problem we're going to face in an aging society. Let's look at the design thinking process. This is the first cut of the process, and we're going to discuss this a little bit more. Remember, we mentioned divergent and convergent thinking. Divergent thinking allowed us to create a lot of ideas or choices, and convergent thinking helped us to make choices, narrow it down, think broad, and then think narrow. So in design thinking process, if we use this 3 steps model, it's called inspiration, ideation, and implementation. So remember, it's inspiration, ideation, and implementation. It's about empathize with the user and customer, understand what's the problem, and then ask yourself, how might we, remember this, how might we solve the problem? Okay. And eventually, how can we make it better? How can we actually create something to make it better in solving the problem? There are different techniques that we use, like observations, framing, developing insight in terms of ideation, like brainstorming. And in terms of implementation, prototyping, experimentation, and learn from the experiment and then repeat. Sometimes come back here. So there's divergent thinking and convergent thinking. It looks like a diamond shape. We did mention that in emphasizing, we want to look at the issue or problem from the customer's or user's perspective. And that is called point of view in design thinking, which means user needs to have certain needs because that's the insight. So if we use kind of a chart, we can list kind of the needs of the users, and what a list of user, sometimes just one type of user, their needs, and then deep down, kind of what's the true reason for their needs. That's called insights. Okay. So user needs to do certain thing because of certain reason, deep down reason. So in order to develop this point of view, you're going to interview some of the user, observe what they're doing and or what they use, understand their life experience and what's considered the value to them, or even the morals of the users. And to gain insights is to learning about your users that you wouldn't have assumed before your observation. Okay, so it's the user plus the insight plus their needs plus their insight. That's the whole so-called point of view. User and its need is the problem, and then the insight is the point of view, as laid out here. So a point of view will eventually allowed us to ideate in the directed manner, which allowed us to create so-called what might we HMW question. We'll explain this HMW later. For instance, if you say a teenager needs more nutritious food because vitamins are vital to good health, and that's everybody kind of know that. However, in deep down, your inside as a teenager girl, by interviewing, talking to them, with the bleak outlook, needs to feel more socially accepted when eating healthy food, because in her mind, a social risk is more dangerous than the health risk. So sometimes they just try to get along, and everybody's eating those junk food, and they will eat the junk food as well, because they want to be socially accepted. So if you want to develop healthy food for teenager, you need to think about how you can make those foods socially accepted. Okay, that's kind of your insight, not just create healthy food. Note later that an actionable and potentially generative problem statement can be developed. Okay, the first statement is just a fact. The second statement here allowed us to kind of inspire us to develop some feasible solutions. So how might we? This is the methods, which is really a brainstorming triggering questions. And you would develop the how might we questions based on the point of view that's developed earlier. And it'll create a seed that is broad enough. Okay, pay attention here. Broad enough that your question is broad enough that they are a wide range of solution, but you also want it to be narrow enough that the team has some helpful boundary in focusing on coming up with solution. Okay, so basically you try to come up, try to scope the problem or the issue properly based on this how might we questions. And so depends on your project, this how might we question can be a little bit broader and a little narrower, depends on different stage of your innovative process. So as an example, okay, if you say how might we create a ice cream corn to eat ice cream without dripping, that's a little bit too narrow. But if you say how might we redesign dessert, that's really broad. But if you say how might we redesign ice cream to be more portable, okay, then that open up a lot of possibility, but at the same time it's narrow enough for you to focus on coming up with a feasible solution. Last not the least, I'm going to use an example to introduce some of the technique that we use and also to illustrate the design thinking. This is called Embrace, and you can find some resource which kind of describe this case, and so go and study it. I'm going to give you a quick kind of summary of the case, the problem. Okay, this, by the way, this was a course at Berkeley called Design for Extreme Affordability. And the problem one team tackle is that 15 million premature and underweight babies die a year. And the reason is babies are so tiny they don't have enough fat to regulate their own body temperature. However, the traditional incubators to keep the baby warm cost as much as $20,000 each. So for poor country, they may not be able to afford it. So their goal is to design low-cost infant incubator for developing world. However, some of the team members went to Nepal and found that in the hospital, they sought and used infant incubators. They're not used. Not that they don't have it. However, they found out a lot of baby was born in the village. They're far away from the hospital. So they changed their design goal to actually try to come up with something that's portable and which if necessary, even without power, because a lot of village may not have enough power, can be still used. And they also found out in Nepal that a lot of time in the regular incubators, that if the doctor say this need to be set to 38 centigrade degree, and people would actually reduce the temperature because they usually adjust even the dosage of medicine because they felt the doctors give too strong a medicine. So in their design, they do have some kind of temperature indicator. They just say okay, so that the user won't mess with the adjustment. So the fact is baby were born at home, hospital is far away, the room temperature at their home are just too cold. That's the fact. The need is they need help right away when the baby was born. So they can at least survive. If they need hospital care, they can survive a long journey to the hospital. The insight is to keep the baby alive for a few hours until they get proper medical attention. So the requirement is young mother in poor and rural area in the developed country. That's the user. Need, always carry baby close to body equals being a good mother. That's their culture, okay? They want to carry the baby with them. And insight, low cultural acceptance in many countries to those incubators in baby warmer device, traditional one. And they don't want to leave the baby alone. So eventually the triggering question is, how might we, HMW, create a non-electrical infant incubator that keep babies close to mother's body? That's how they frame their problem or requirement. How might we create a non-electrical infant incubator that keeps baby close to mother's body? This is their prototype 0.0. This is their 1.0 prototype, which looks actually very much like a sleeping bag. And this is the final design, and it does looks like a sleeping bag. Inside the sleeping bag, there's something called paraffin, which can be heated in hot water, or they also have alternative electrical device which can heat it up. And the paraffin would keep that heat for about 6 hours in constant temperature, which is good body temperature to keep the baby warm. Okay. And the student group eventually started a non-profit organization to produce this. They're raising money, and so they work with some non-profit organization in those developing world to distribute this Embrace infant warmers. It is a product with a mission. So this, and they reduced the cost from about $20,000 to $200. That's a dramatic reduction in terms of the cost. And the process they use is really based on design thinking and with a noble cost. So basically, I hope this case will give you some idea how design thinking may be used in your endeavor, which doesn't have to be for-profit business, but can be for non-for-profit, and try to address a social problem, create maybe a social business through the design thinking process. Okay, that's it for now. We'll come back and continue our discussion of design thinking for the second installment. Thank you. Bye-bye.